My global families, tomorrow will be the same as today if we don't fix today. My greatest concern as a 1619 slave descendant is to be able to assist our governments to empower us in many other ways other than welfare. We have the natural, legitimate, and inalienable right to decide for ourselves as descendants of slaves. One of that rights is to be able to assist their governments to assist us in many other ways other than welfare. We must help reshape our social welfare structure traditions by changing economic and social conditions. This will surely help us, slave descendants, and take off the stress from our taxpayers who have been good to us for so long. This action will enable us as a group to organize ourselves, help our governments wherever we are in this time by working towards productivity. I always look at how we can maintain economic stability, promote economic growth, and reduce economic disparities among the 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants. And most of all, regain our respect as a group forced out of Africa through slavery 424 years ago. I always supported the strict border policies to the United States of America by former President Donald Trump. It is the best choice for all Americans, especially Black African Americans communities in the United States. This will also help the rest of the Americas, such as South America and countries on the American continent, to make their country their home. They were placed there by nature, through birth, in those geographical areas in the Americas to manage their given independent countries. Their responsibilities is to keep their country and citizens in good economic condition and avoid the country being unattended to or deserted. Borders encouraged that. I blessed the decision maker, former President Donald Trump's visions of a secured border to the United States and many other policies he had suggested. We cannot deny that former President Donald Trump takes that position with the best interest of his country in mind. When he repeats the slogan, "America First," I believe he sincerely meant it. My major concern today is for African political leaders to inculcate the understanding that they must stop giving away to China and Russia our families at home as modern-day military slaves, along with the natural resources and the arable lands that belonged to us 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants, and avoid the anger we express. This can free Africa from the errors caused by selling our ancestors into brutal slavery that caused us to be separated till date. We want to be better contributors as slave descendants in our countries of birth. You must give back what belonged to us, that was taken and still being taken in a non-stop, lawless manner. I personally classify this behavior as greed and ignorance on behalf of you political leaders of Africa. who continue to be a cancer to all Africans in and out of Africa. My reaction as a slave descendant is to stop this inhumane behavior that have been simmering for too long that can cause a global catastrophe. I believe it is time that you stop material greed so that the world can have peace. You African political leaders can help me to do just that. To be a 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants is to be a rejected black group that was thrown out of Africa. To be a slave trade descendant is to lack the power to speak on policies that could bring changes that could help us, trade descendants. To be able to point to Africa and say that is where we are from. We are given our rights to introduce policies in the Americas, England, and Europe. We are given leadership positions in these countries out of our mother continent, Africa. God bless those countries that bought our ancestors as human cattle. They acknowledge their ancestors' mistakes and trying their best to correct it with new and improved policies constantly. They give us slave descendants independent actually in all of the countries our ancestors labored on in the Caribbean and South America. You African leaders gave us nothing, absolutely nothing. You are still in the habit of selling anything you can find to sell, including humans. The conditions of us 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants are the product of your kingdom rulers and their then business policies that is still in place today, which sold my ancestors as cattle and has nothing to do with their abilities nor their capacities. People around the world are witnessing daily in Africa. Our biological families are still being thrown out of Africa in different ways today into the Mediterranean Sea, dying thoughtlessly, shamelessly, and untimely, even sold as body parts into some meat markets in and out of Africa. Some are languishing in jails around the world. To be a 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendant is also to be different from all other human groups. But difference doesn't mean we shouldn't have rights. Today, I am here on this global platform demanding our rights to help our governments wherever we are by helping to make changes to our welfare system in our respected, beloved countries, such as Canada, United States of America, England, and Europe. Also to help take the burden off of the hard-working tax-paying citizens that are supporting us constantly. We must be able to contribute to our society and not be helpless dependents. Our ancestors were never poor, and we must have what rightfully belongs to us 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants. Let remitting to us be the option of a path to Mother Africa's salvation through your cooperation. My fundamental factor for this unpleasant proactive decision is because of the continuous unscrupulous behavior of you African political leaders' selfish, cruel, and wasteful attitude with the backing of some of your kingdom rulers in Africa. I hereby demand that reparation funds should be paid to us descendants of 1619 Atlantic slave trade to whatever trust company we choose. This action will save you African leaders the trouble of securing your integrity from this present embarrassing situation that the reparation fund is causing you through your demand for reparation that does not belong to you. You are still in this modern day reselling us slave descendants again as stocks and bonds. I know that some of you African traditional kings and political leaders are very cruel when it comes to ethnical hatred. But Africa owes us a debt, and we intend to collect. We still suffer genetically from the agony inflicted on us through our ancestors long since dead. Today, we descendants are demanding that you, the African leaders, must compensate us of 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants for the brutality and willful killings and enslavement of our ancestors in Africa during the capturing of them for slave market profits. I'm demanding that African governments must return lands and compensate us 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants for the injustices done to our ancestors at home in Africa, along with the injustices done in slavery out of Africa. Presently, some of our relatives are running away from home Africa to join us in diaspora as a result of this same terrible situation my ancestors faced when they were home in Africa during the 15 and 1619 period. This situation put us in the eyes of other groups as inferior and worthless as a people. I am afraid that my demand will aggravate many of you selfish African political leaders and might inspire you to do evil to me and my family. But nevertheless, this must be done. Slavery was evil, and karma, which is the law of nature, is now activated, as we all can see. No race, ethnic, or religious group have suffered so much over so long span as we slave descendants, and still at the hands of you all who continue to benefit from our continuous suffering. We become bargaining brands for human stocks and bonds in a modern-day slavery. We all know that compensations are not the final measures to address past atrocities. But it can go a little way, since we are locked in a vicious cycle of poverty that still exists within us, slave descendants, globally. I believe, like any other Africans in Africa, my rights to ancestral properties. I demand our ancestral lands in every state or province in countries in Africa as a part of restitution in my petition. I demand our rights to do what we choose to do with our ancestral properties. I want African governments that were directly involved in 1619 Atlantic slave trade to compensate us slave descendants for historical injustices and the willful waste of our ancestors' lives by the millions in and out of Africa. My ancestors were sacrificed, killed by the thousands in sessions per day for the hungry false gods, along with their stupid practice of rituals for royal burials. Some flesh were fed to hungry prisoners to gain strength to go to work as captured slave workers. Sadly, some of these actions were done in Dahomey, Africa. I wish to re-emphasize that our ancestors' history have been written with shame, rape, sodomy, blood, along with slavery and violent deaths by the millions. It is a history of defeat, but not now. I wish to further state that whenever a people find themselves defeated, they have but one option: to rise up and do something about it. And what we, as 1619 Atlantic slave descendants, are doing through my divine supervision is to regain our respect as Atlantic Slave Descendants Group in diaspora and our ancestors' properties in Africa. However, our history is not just slavery. We want to rise again with dignity and respect along with economic freedom not only for us slave descendants, but for our brothers and sisters from Africa who are also thrown out into diaspora through economic, political, and psychological pressures, along with continuous killings caused by you, greedy political leaders of the day, who turned terrorism into POS and ATM machines. Why am I asking you, African governments, to comply with my demands? I want countries that were involved in 1619 Atlantic slave trade to stop slave reparations to Africa. Funds must be paid directly to slave descendants of 1619 Atlantic slave trade legally. We also want our own sovereign country on our continent, Africa. In Ghana, Cape Coast, and Tekrati, I claim as our properties our ancestors forced labored without pay before transferred out, suffered, and died. In Nigeria, Badagry City, a part of Lagos, I also demand in my petition, with further claims to be mentioned in the West Africa region during our legal presentation for justice. During the 1619 slave trade, your greedy ancestors traded with the Arabs, Indians, and Chinese where they acquired clothes, utensils, weapons in exchange for strong men, along with gold crops like millet, etc. This action has started all over again with China and Russia. You political leaders in Africa are giving away resources for arms that will soon be used to kill your own people, along with sending your people to die overseas in frontline battles, just like your ancestors did to my ancestors during slavery. Is it your nature or just wickedness? Your ancestors were paid satisfactorily for selling our ancestors into slavery in 1619, and you African political leaders today are still collecting compensation for injustices in our name. What injustices have you suffered? Anyhow, I can clearly see chattelization as a central element of transatlantic slavery. Every phase in my submission constitutes wrongful conduct that occurred in Africa, especially in West Africa during the 1619 Atlantic slave trade. I spent over a decade in West Africa between Ghana and Nigeria and found out that Africans that were involved in the selling, buying, and enslavement of my ancestors have already benefited greatly. So I am of the opinion that all reparations should be given to us, the descendants of 1619 Atlantic slave trade, along with compensations for injustices done to our ancestors and us, the descendants in diaspora. Let me outline some of the lingering effects facing us 1619 slave descendants, still lingering under psychological, financial, and social pressures, still not accepted in Africa as a family on legal grounds, still suffering in diaspora, still more likely to be stigmatized in some foreign countries, charged, falsely convicted, and imprisoned, still seen by some ethnic groups in Africa as slave people without value, still considered by some Africans ethnic groups as human robots to be used and disposed of, still seen as a commodity when visiting Africa. I can never place a price on our suffering and pain or wash away the blood of our ancestors that was shed at the hands of their enslavers, those who sold and those who bought. We have a solemn responsibility to seek what is rightfully due to us in keeping with these domestic and international laws in order to heal, repair, and restore ourselves as a people. Reparations to us 1619 Atlantic slave descendants should improve our lives and our future generations to come. Apology and restitutions make no sense if it's not going to the right people. This will surely complicate matters. It will also cause African leaders of the day to buy into the sinful act all over again. It is said that we lived in a world full of choices. And now we are at a crossroad where we must make decisions with choices which will influence our lives as slave descendants who lived out of Africa for centuries well into the future of what we call time. I have decided not to wait, but to fight legally for our rights as slave descendants for the finances that belongs to us, which will put us in a better position to be able to make further contribution towards our country's economic development where we live. I know that the legal battle can be a difficult one, but it is the only road that leads to a prosperous future for us slave descendants out of Africa. At present, we gain no benefit from our ancestors' forceful labors and debt. Slave descendants' benefits are going to the stomach of you wicked, greedy African political horrible leaders on the continent of Africa, and not to the rightful benefactors, the slave descendants. Africa is rich in natural resources in abundance and not poor. Why should we suffer by you taking away the little that belongs to us slave descendants? In the last half-century, the economic conditions are not getting better for us as slave descendants out of Africa. The economic challenges that are facing us must be fixed and directed to reduce the problem so that we will be economically able to compete in the 21st century marketplace with dignity and respect as a people. I have learned from history that we are rejected and thrown out of Africa and still seen by most Africans on the continent as slave people on our return to Africa. So sad. My petition is a demand for our ancestors' compensation to be given directly to us of 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants to assist us to live a purposeful life and make much more positive contribution to the society we live, with respect for ourselves and all life forms on our planet. My purpose in this time is to leave a legacy for our children and our children's children. For this reason, we must fix this problem that still denies our humanity and self-respect, that keeps us lingering in our present conditions for too long. You, our brothers on the continent of Africa, are still receiving gifts on our heads. This I label as extended slavery bonus. Reparations are the key to transformation of our current economic position. We must receive what is due to us and stop this economic imbalance ongoing problems. Here is my stand. I want full formal apology from African governments that were involved in 1619 Atlantic slave trade. I want defaulted countries to stop negotiating reparation funds with African governments pertaining to the 1619 Atlantic slave trade. I want reparations to come directly to us slave descendants of 1619 Atlantic slave trade. I want to regain ancestral properties and rights in African countries that were involved in 1619 Atlantic slave trade. I want compensations to be directed to slave descendants out of Africa for historical injustices caused by transatlantic slave trade on our ancestors, and not to any government in Africa, but to slave descendants of 1619 Atlantic slave trade only. I want African governments to acknowledge the injustices done to our ancestors and the waste of our ancestors' life by the millions in and out of Africa. I want all countries involved in 1619 Atlantic slave trade to join hands across the world to assist towards giving us what is due to us who are legitimate slave descendants. I want the International Criminal Court (ICC) to examine my claims and to be able to make international constitutional rights laws for us 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants in and out of Africa for proper implementation of ancestral rights. These injustices must be corrected. I want to be given back our ancestors' lands and other properties under constitutional rights in each state or provinces in Africa for the purpose of building 1619 Atlantic slave trade cities in Africa countries for us who choose to return to Africa. I want transnational citizenship on arrival to any African country of choice. I want the right to vote from diaspora in Africa for the country we are transnational citizens, and the right to run for political office as an African out of Africa for the development of Africa. I want a portion of arable land to be partitioned for our new country in Africa with mineral resources for us slave descendants. I want us to be a sovereign nation that maintains self-determination, self-governance, and self-reliance on the continent of Africa. I want full sovereign rights and our own autonomous governmental structures. I want those lands that were forcefully taken from my ancestors in all the states of Africa to be given back to us. It is a history about us slave descendants who struggled first for our freedom to the state of a human being in every country that we live. That is the result of more than 424 years of dehumanization, alienation, slavery, denial of self-identification and self-knowledge that we 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants Africans went through and still going through. Furthermore, I wish to state our position. Reparations to African Union AU for 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants must be paid to us directly through the sources we choose to manage our funds and distribute to us as agreed upon. I want African countries that ever applied or received reparations on our behalf to return to us all funds, and also must acknowledge us returnees of slave descendants of 1619 Atlantic slave trade and give us the right to regain ancestral properties in that country on return. I want African governments to stop bombarding by forcing countries that were involved in slavery for reparations for us 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants. We are capable of doing that for ourselves. I want African leaders to know I am serious with my claims for our rights as 1619 Atlantic slave trade descendants and have no malice, hate, or grudge against my brothers and sisters in Africa. All I want is what rightfully belongs to us as a group of Atlantic slave trade descendants in diaspora, so that we can stop being a group of dependable citizens in our beloved countries and help remove the burden that is placed on others by us getting off social assistance. This will enable us to help our governments create jobs and regain our respect as slave descendants, a special group out of Africa. May God continue to bless us with love and light of understanding to work towards this direction of economic liberation for our group as slave descendants of 1619 Atlantic slave trade. Thank you for listening. Your anticipated cooperation and support is expected. Peace.